The prairie wind carried the scent of dust and wild sage across the open land, humming like a lonely song beneath the rising moon. Nights in the Wild West had their own kind of silence, not empty but full of secrets. The rustle of dry grass, the creak of leather, the low call of a night bird somewhere far off. The moonlight spilled across the wide valley, catching on the outlines of the ridges and the weathered fences that had been standing longer than most men had lived there. Somewhere beyond that silence, the beat of hooves echoed slow and steady, carrying with it a story that had not yet been told, one of love, defiance, and a longing that dared to bloom where the world seemed too harsh for tender roots. She had come west, looking for a new beginning, though the journey had cost her nearly everything. Dust still clung to the hem of her dress, and her hands bore the marks of travel, but her spirit remained unbroken. Folks around town whispered about her, how she carried herself too proud, how her eyes seemed to watch everything like she was guarding a secret. No one knew exactly where she came from, and that was how she preferred it. Out here, the land didn't much care about your past, only if you were strong enough to survive it. Under the wide sky, she often wondered if survival was enough. He was nothing like the men she had known before, where others looked at her with either judgment or pity. He had a way of tilting his head and smiling as if he knew she was testing the ground beneath her feet, deciding whether to stay or run. His laugh carried warmth, but his eyes held storms, and though he teased, there was weight behind every word he spoke. He belonged to the land in a way she could never claim, his shoulders strong as the ridges, his movements quiet as the deer slipping through the brush. People called him a drifter, though his roots ran deeper than most, tied to the blood and the soil of his people. They first crossed paths under the orange glow of sunset when the air smelled of wood smoke and fresh hay. She had been standing near the well, cupping water to her lips, when she caught him watching. There had been no shame in it, only curiosity. He had tipped his hat, and for a moment the world slowed, as if waiting for what might come next. That was the way of the West chance meetings that could turn a life in one direction or another. The days that followed brought them together in ways neither expected. She had a way of softening the edges of the hard country, seeing beauty where others saw only struggle. He, in turn, showed her the land as it truly was, its dangers, its rhythms, and its wildness that could not be tamed. They clashed often, her stubbornness against his quiet authority, yet somewhere in those sparks, a bond was forged. At night, when the moon was high and the coyotes called from the far hills, she sometimes found herself listening for the sound of his voice. It lingered in her mind, deep and teasing, pulling her closer, even when she tried to keep her distance. She told herself it was foolish, that she had not come all this way to be drawn into another entanglement, especially one with a man whose life was carved from the unpredictable winds of the frontier. But her heart did not listen to reason. The land itself seemed to conspire with their growing closeness. Storms rolled in suddenly, forcing them to share shelter beneath rocky overhangs, making his steady guidance the only thing keeping her from losing her way. And then there were the moments that had no words, just the brush of a hand when he passed her the reins, or the way his gaze lingered a second too long when firelight touched her face. Still, there was something unsaid between them, something that weighed as heavy as the clouds that gathered before a storm. She had secrets, a past that clawed at her heels. He carried his own burdens, tied to the land and the people who had lived there long before fences divided it. Both of them knew that love in the West was not simple. It came with danger, with sacrifice, and with the risk of losing everything. One evening, when the valley was painted silver by the rising moon, they found themselves alone by the riverbank. The water shimmered, restless and alive, echoing the tension that had grown between them. She turned her face away, heart pounding, as he stepped closer. His words came low, like a dare and a promise all at once, telling her he would stand with her if she asked. Her breath caught, torn between the instinct to flee and the pull to stay. "Shh, go slower," she whispered, her voice barely rising above the rush of the river. He only smiled, that teasing glint in his eyes that made her pulse race. "Darlin, stand with me," he murmured, as though the moon itself had been waiting for him to speak. The air seemed to tighten, thick with something unspoken. And for the first time she felt that the choice before her was not about survival, but about surrendering to the unknown. The night held its breath, waiting for what she might say, and in that fragile pause, the sound of hooves thundered in the distance, breaking the spell. She froze, every muscle tense, while he turned his head toward the ridge, listening. Trouble was coming faster than either of them expected. The Wild West was never still for long, and under the wide moon, both of them knew the quiet moment they shared was about to shatter. Would she trust him enough to stand at his side, or would the ghosts of her past drive her to run before dawn broke? The river kept rushing, the horses drew nearer, and the moon cast its silver light over the two of them, holding their secrets in silence. The answer hung in the night, unspoken, as danger rode closer. The rumble of hooves echoed like distant thunder, and she felt it rattle inside her chest. The night air shifted, carrying dust and tension with it, while the river's voice grew louder as though urging them to move. He stood still, shoulders squared, eyes narrowed toward the ridge where shadows moved against the moonlight. She wanted to ask who it was, but the words caught in her throat. In that silence, she understood that whoever rode toward them meant no good. He touched her arm, steady but firm, guiding her back into the cover of the cottonwoods. She followed, though her heart pounded with unease. Branches whispered above, and the moonlight broke through in silver patches across the ground. He moved like the land itself, quiet and sure, every step calculated to keep them hidden. She envied that kind of control. All her instincts told her to run, but running would give them away, and she knew enough to trust his lead. When the riders came into view, she glimpsed dark outlines against the pale valley. Their pace was fast, their voices low and sharp, but carried by the night wind. She could not make out their words, yet the tone was enough to chill her. These were not men out for a casual ride beneath the stars. They were hunting something or someone. Her thoughts turned bitter, circling back to her past. Trouble had followed her before, and she had sworn never to let it catch her again. Yet here she was, standing in the shadows with a man who had his own storms to fight. She wondered if he knew just how much danger she carried within her, how many things she had tried to bury beneath miles of trail and endless sky. Maybe fate had brought her west, but fate could be cruel as often as kind. The riders slowed near the riverbank, their horses restless on the rocks. Moonlight revealed their faces for a brief instant rough. Hardened men, the kind that carved fear into every place they passed. She bit the inside of her cheek to keep from gasping. He did not move, his hand still hovering near hers, a silent warning for her to stay quiet. Every second stretched long, heavy with the chance of being found. After a while, the riders urged their horses onward, following the bend of the river deeper into the valley. The thunder of hooves faded, leaving behind only the rushing water and the distant cry of a nighthawk. She let out the breath she had been holding, but the tension in her body did not ease. She turned to him, expecting answers, but his gaze stayed fixed on the trail where the riders had vanished.
Ow!
"They're not after us," he finally said, voice low. "Not yet." The words did not comfort her. Not yet meant danger still lingered close, waiting. He glanced at her then, his eyes catching a sliver of moonlight, and she felt the weight of what he wasn't saying. There were battles in his life that went beyond her understanding, old rivalries and new threats born of the land's harshness. She wanted to ask who those men were, but part of her feared the truth. Instead, she looked away, to the river glinting silver in the night. "Do you always live with shadows like that?" she asked softly. His smile was small, tired, yet it reached his eyes. "Out here, shadows come with the land. You learn to stand with them, or you don't last." She thought about that long after they left the riverbank. The path back to the small settlement wound through brush and rocky ground, the kind that could twist an ankle in the dark. He led her carefully, one hand steady on her arm when the earth shifted beneath her feet. She resented the need for his help, yet she couldn't deny the strange comfort in knowing someone cared whether she stumbled or not. By the time they reached the cabins, the sky had begun to pale with the promise of dawn. Smoke rose from a few chimneys, and the faint sound of a rooster carried through the stillness. Life was stirring again, but for her, the night lingered heavy. She stood at the doorway of her cabin, hesitating. He waited, silent, not pressing her to speak. That was his way, teasing when the moment was light, but patient when the air turned serious. She admired it, though it unnerved her all the same. "There are things I can't tell you," she whispered, more to herself than to him. His jaw tightened, but he only nodded. "Then don't tell me yet. Just don't lie." The words cut deeper than she expected. She wanted to promise, but fear held her tongue. So she turned instead, slipping inside her cabin, leaving him beneath the fading moonlight. Sleep did not come easily. She lay awake listening to the wind scratch at the shutters, her mind replaying the sight of those riders. Her past clawed at her thoughts, dragging up memories she had tried to bury. She had run far, farther than most would dare, yet here she was again, tangled in something she did not fully understand. Was it chance, or had the West decided her fate long before she set foot in it? When morning light finally spilled across the valley, she rose, dressing with hands that trembled slightly. The settlement looked ordinary in the sun, women hanging laundry, men saddling horses, children chasing each other across the dusty street. But she knew better than to trust appearances. Shadows lingered even in daylight, and danger often wore the face of routine. He was waiting near the corral, brushing down his horse. She thought about avoiding him, but something drew her closer. Maybe it was the steadiness he carried. Maybe it was the way he looked at her, as though he already saw the truth she tried so hard to hide. "Those men," she said quietly, "do you know them?" He paused, brushing hands slowing over the horse's mane. For a long moment he didn't answer, and she wondered if he'd turned the question back on her. But then he sighed, eyes fixed on the distant hills. "I know the kind. They ride for coin, not justice. And coin makes men dangerous." Her throat tightened. That was exactly the kind of danger she had run from, the kind that could find her no matter how far she traveled. She wanted to believe he would protect her, that the strength she saw in him would be enough to hold the shadows at bay. But she had learned not to lean too hard on anyone. Trust was a luxury she wasn't sure she could afford. Still, when his gaze met hers again, something unspoken passed between them. Promise, maybe, or a warning. She couldn't tell which, and that uncertainty made her heart ache. The days that followed were restless. The settlement went about its usual work, mending fences, hauling water, trading supplies, but an unease hung in the air. Every distant hoofbeat set her nerves on edge. Every time she caught sight of a stranger's face, she searched it for signs of recognition. At night, the coyotes howled louder, and she wondered if the land itself was trying to warn her. He stayed near, though never too close. Sometimes he would tease, tossing a remark that made her bristle, then soften with a smile that lingered too long. Other times he watched her quietly, as if measuring how much weight she'd carried. She hated that he could see her so clearly, yet part of her longed for him to keep looking. One evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, she stood outside her cabin, watching the sky. The air was heavy, promising a storm. He approached, his shadow stretching long beside hers. "They'll be back," he said simply. Her chest tightened. "For you, or for me?" He tilted his head, studying her, and she knew he already suspected. Maybe he had from the start. She swallowed hard, unable to give him an answer. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain and dust. Somewhere in the distance, a horse whinnied, sharp and urgent. She turned toward the sound, her stomach knotting. Trouble was closer now, pressing against the edges of the valley. He laid a hand on the reins slung over his shoulder, his body tense, ready. She felt her breath catch, the world narrowing down to the storm on the horizon, and the question burning in her chest. Would she finally tell him the truth, or let silence become the wedge that pushed them apart when the danger came? The first drops of rain fell, cold against her skin, and the sky darkened above. The moment to decide was slipping away, and the night promised no mercy. The rain came hard and fast, drumming on the roofs of the settlement and churning the dirt into slick mud. She pulled her shawl tighter, standing just under the eaves of her cabin, watching the storm roll over the valley. He was out in it, moving between the corrals and the barn, securing what could be tied down before the wind took it. She admired the calm in his movements, the way he didn't fight the storm but worked with it. He moved like someone who had seen worse than a bit of rain. Her chest ached with the weight of unspoken truth. The men by the river were not strangers to her. They were part of a past she had hoped would never find her again. Men who lived by threat and violence, men who would not stop until they got what they wanted. She had left that life behind, or at least she thought she had. Now the storm outside felt like a mirror of the one gathering inside her. The settlement seemed quieter that night, the storm keeping most folks indoors. But inside the tavern, Light spilled onto the muddy street and voices rose in laughter that tried too hard to be carefree. She stepped inside, needing the noise, needing to remind herself she was not alone. The tavern smelled of smoke and damp wool, and the air was heavy with the sound of boots tapping against the floorboards. She slipped into a corner, keeping her eyes low, though she felt the weight of curious glances. He entered not long after, water dripping from his hat brim, his presence filling the room. Gave her a small nod, nothing more. But it was enough to settle her nerves. He joined a table near the stove where older ranch hands played cards, his laughter low but genuine. She watched him for longer than she should have, until one of the women at the bar leaned toward her with a sly smile. "You new around here still catches his eye?" the woman said softly, voice edged with mischief. Heat rushed to her cheeks and she looked away. "I'm not looking for trouble." "Trouble finds all of us out here," the woman replied, her smile fading into something more somber. "Best decide now if you'll stand against it or let it roll you under." The words struck deep, though she said nothing. She finished her drink quickly and left before anyone else could ask questions. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, and the muddy street gleamed in the lamplight. She hurried back to her cabin, wishing she could leave her fears behind, as easily as the tavern's noise. That night, sleep came fitful and broken. She dreamed of shadows moving through the valley, of voices calling her name in tones that promised nothing but harm. She woke before dawn, heart racing, and stepped outside to find the sky still heavy with clouds. He was already there, saddling his horse, his movements sure and steady as always. "You're restless," he said without looking at her. She tried to keep her voice steady. "So are you." He gave a faint smile, tightening the cinch. "The land talks, if you know how to listen." "It says the storm wasn't the only thing riding in last night." Her throat tightened. "You think they're close?" His gaze flicked to her, sharp and searching. "I know they are. The question is who they're after." She looked away, the weight of his words pressing hard. Every instinct told her to confess, to tell him exactly why those men would never stop hunting. All fear sealed her lips. If he knew, would he still stand with her, or would he turn away? Trust was a dangerous thing in a world built on survival. As the day stretched on, tension crept through the settlement like a snake in tall grass. Riders came and went, but every unfamiliar face was watched closely. The blacksmith muttered about locking tools away. The storekeeper kept his rifle behind the counter. And mothers pulled their children inside earlier than usual. No one said it outright, but everyone felt the unease. She kept to herself, helping with laundry, mending torn clothes, anything to keep her hands busy. But her mind wandered, always circling back to the same fear. She thought about running again, leaving before the riders returned. Yet every time she looked toward the horizon, she remembered his words by the river, the quiet strength in his promise. Gosh, if she left now, she would always be running. Later that evening, he found her near the well, hauling up water with slow, weary motions. "You ever think of going back?" he asked, leaning against the post with casual ease. She froze, the rope slipping slightly in her hands. "Back where?" His smile was faint, but his eyes were serious. "Wherever you came from? Folks don't drift this far west without reason. Sometimes that reason keeps chasing." The bucket clattered against the side of the well as she set it down too quickly. Her hands shook, but she forced her voice calm. "Going back isn't an option." He studied her a moment, then nodded, as if that was answer enough. Still, the silence between them stretched heavy, and she could feel the unspoken questions pressing close. That night, a scout rode in from the far ridge with news that set the whole settlement on edge. Strange riders had been seen again, circling the valley, never coming close enough to confront, but always near enough to remind them they were there. Men gathered their rifles, women barred their doors, and the tavern's laughter died into whispers. She stood at her window, watching the lanterns flicker across the settlement. The unease had become a living thing, pressing against every wall, every shadow. When she turned, she found him standing at her doorway, raincoat slung over his shoulders. "They're testing us," he said quietly. Seeing how long before fear cracks this place open, her heart pounded. And when it does, his gaze locked with hers, steady and unflinching. "That's when we find out who stands and who runs." The words struck deep, leaving her breathless. He didn't push further, didn't ask the questions she wasn't ready to answer. Instead, he simply tipped his hat and left, disappearing into the night. But his presence lingered, filling the small cabin long after he was gone. She sat by the window, staring at the dark horizon, wondering how much longer she could keep her secrets hidden. The days that followed blurred together, a tense waiting game. Supplies were rationed, children kept indoors, and watchmen took shifts through the night. Every rider on the trail was challenged, every noise in the dark met with a hand on a rifle. Yet still the strangers did not strike. They circled, they watched, they waited. Inside her, the storm grew. She thought often about the woman's words at the tavern decide. Now, if you'll stand against trouble, or let it roll you under. She had been running so long she had almost forgotten what it felt like to stand. Now, with danger pressing closer each night, she wondered if she still had the strength to fight. One evening, she walked down to the river alone, needing the sound of water to clear her thoughts. The moon rose pale above the ridges, casting silver across the restless current. She closed her eyes, remembering his voice by this same river, the way he had dared her to stand with him. The sound of footsteps broke her thoughts. She turned sharply, heart leaping, only to see him emerge from the shadows. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes held the same storm she felt inside. "You can't carry this weight alone," he said quietly, her breath caught. "What if I don't have a choice?" "There's always a choice." His words were firm, but not unkind. "You've got to decide if you'll trust someone enough to share it." The river rushed between them. Carrying the question she couldn't answer, she wanted to tell him everything, to let the truth spill out and wash her clean. But the fear of what it might cost kept her silent. And then, from the far ridge, came the sharp cry of a signal whistle. It cut through the night like a blade, and her blood turned cold. He stiffened, eyes narrowing, every muscle tense. "They're closer than ever," he said, his voice a low growl. She looked toward the dark horizon, fear clawing at her chest. The signal meant the waiting was nearly over. Soon the shadows would strike, and her secrets would no longer stay buried. The night air trembled with tension, and the river kept rushing, carrying away the last fragile pieces of peace they had left. The sharp whistle echoed across the valley, fading into the restless hum of the river. She felt it reverberate through her bones, a sound too precise to be mistaken for anything natural. It was a call, a signal, and she knew what followed would bring no peace. He stood still, shoulders squared, eyes fixed on the ridge as if trying to measure how many men waited beyond the dark horizon. She wanted to ask, but the words stuck in her throat. Some truths didn't need to be spoken aloud to be understood. The night felt heavy, thick with a silence that pressed down on the land. Even the coyotes held their voices, as though the wild things understood danger had stepped closer. He finally turned toward her, his jaw tight, voice low but steady. "They're done circling. The waiting's near over." Her stomach twisted. She had known this moment would come, yet she still wasn't ready. Every mile she had traveled west had been to escape, to outrun the ghosts of her past. But trouble had long legs, and here it was again, waiting just across the ridge. She clutched her shawl closer, as if the thin fabric could shield her from what loomed ahead. He studied her, his gaze piercing as if he could see the storm raging inside. "You've been carrying something," he said, not accusing but certain. "Those men. They're not strangers to you, are they?" The river roared between them, filling the space her silence left behind. She wanted to lie, to shake her head and turn away, but his eyes demanded the truth. Still, fear clawed at her throat, sealing the words inside. If she confessed, she risked losing the one steady presence she had found in this wild country. If she kept quiet, she might doom them all. Before she could decide, the wind shifted, carrying faint sounds from the ridge horses snorting, saddles creaking, men's voices muffled in the distance. His expression hardened, the storm in his eyes darkening into something fierce. "It's starting," he murmured. "We need to get back." The ride to the settlement was fast and tense. The moon lit the path in silver, but every shadow seemed alive, every rustle in the brush a threat. She clung to the saddle, her heart racing with every beat of the horse's hooves. By the time they reached the cabins, lanterns were already flickering in the windows, and voices rose in uneasy whispers. "Ah!" The settlement had heard the signal too. Men gathered near the corral, rifles slung over their shoulders, faces grim. The blacksmith muttered about fortifying the barn, while the storekeeper spoke of hiding supplies. Fear threaded through every word, but so did determination. This was a place carved out of hardship, and its people would not give it up easily. She stood on the edge of the gathering, hands trembling as she pulled her shawl tighter. A woman brushed past her, whispering, "They'll be coming. It's only a matter of time." The words sank like stones into her chest. He stepped forward, his voice calm but commanding. "We don't know how many there are, but we know they've been circling. They're testing us. They'll strike when they think we're weak. Can't give them that chance." The men nodded, some with grim acceptance, others with fire in their eyes. Plans formed quickly. Who would guard the river crossing? Who would watch the ridge? Who would stay near the cabins? It was a patchwork defense, but it was all they had. She felt torn, caught between the urge to run and the pull to stay. Every instinct screamed to flee before the riders descended, to vanish into the night before her secrets were dragged into the open. Yet, when she looked at the faces of the settlers, the mothers clutching children, the men tightening their grips on worn rifles, she knew running would mean leaving them to face the danger she had brought with her. The night dragged on, each hour stretching longer than the last. Lanterns burned low, casting shadows that danced across the cabin walls. The settlement held its breath, waiting for the first shot, the first cry, the first thunder of hooves breaking the fragile quiet. She could not rest. Every creak of wood, every gust of wind against the shutters set her nerves on edge. At one point she thought she heard movement outside her cabin and nearly cried out. But when she peeked through the window, it was only him, walking the perimeter with the patience of a man who knew what it meant to wait for danger. Near dawn, word came from the scouts. Tracks had been found by the river, fresh and many. The riders had crossed in the night and now lay hidden somewhere within the valley. The air thickened with dread. The settlers knew what that meant. The storm was nearly here. She found him near the barn, checking his horse's gear with steady hands. She wanted to tell him everything then, to pour out the truth before it was too late. But the sound of children crying nearby stopped her. The weight of their fear pressed down, and she swallowed the words. Confession would have to wait. Survival came first. That day passed in uneasy quiet. The sun burned hot overhead, but no one worked the fields. Instead, eyes stayed fixed on the ridges, rifles leaned within reach, and whispers carried through the air like restless spirits. She walked the edges of the settlement, her thoughts a storm of guilt and fear. Each face she passed reminded her of what was at stake. By evening, the tension reached its breaking point. The scouts returned again, this time with more urgency. The riders had been spotted not a mile from the settlement, hidden in the brush, watching. The settlers gathered quickly, weapons in hand, voices low but resolute. The waiting was nearly done. He stood at the center, steady as ever, though she saw the weight in his eyes. He turned to her briefly, his voice low. "When it starts, stay close. Don't run." Her throat tightened. "And if they're here because of me?" His gaze didn't waver. "Then you'll have to decide if you're ready to stop running." The words cut deep, stirring both fear and something fiercer inside her. She nodded, though her heart trembled. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of fire before sinking into darkness. The valley grew quiet again, too quiet, the kind of silence that comes before a storm breaks. Lanterns flickered in the cabins, casting long shadows that swayed with the restless wind. She stood near him, every muscle tight, waiting for the first sign. The settlers shifted uneasily, rifles in hand, eyes straining against the dark. And then it came, the distant thunder of hooves, rolling closer, louder, until the sound filled the valley. Her breath caught. Shapes emerged from the ridge, black against the pale moon, spreading wide as they rode down. Voices rose, sharp and commanding, and the settlers braced themselves, the air charged with fear and defiance. He placed a steady hand on her arm, his eyes never leaving the riders. "This is it," he said, voice low but certain. Her heart pounded so hard she thought it might break her chest. The riders swept closer, their numbers greater than she had feared, their shadows swallowing the land. She gripped the shawl at her shoulders, every instinct screaming to flee, yet his touch anchored her in place. The thunder of hooves shook the ground. the riders' shouts cutting through the night. The settlers raised their rifles, lantern light gleaming on barrels, breath held in the final fragile pause before the storm crashed down. And in that moment, with danger rushing toward them and secrets burning in her chest, she realized there was no more time. The past had caught her at last, and the fight she had tried so hard to avoid was now pounding at the edge of the settlement. The riders closed in, the earth trembling, the moon blazing above. The night held its breath as the clash drew near, and she stood caught between fear and resolve. Knowing the next heartbeat would change everything, the thunder of hooves filled the valley as the riders surged closer, their shadows long and sharp under the pale glow of the wild west moon. The settlers stood their ground, rifles raised, hearts pounding, every soul braced for the storm that had been circling them for too long. She felt her breath catch in her throat, every muscle locked tight. The moment she had feared, the moment she had tried to run from, had arrived. There was no more escaping the truth. The leader of the riders reined in his horse just beyond the edge of the lantern light. His voice carried hard and cruel, demanding they hand over what belonged to him. Her blood ran cold. His words weren't meant for the settlement. Not really. They were meant for her. She felt it like a knife twisting deep inside. The ghosts of her past had finally spoken, and now everyone would know. The settlers shifted uneasily, murmurs rippling through the crowd, stepped forward, calm and unflinching, his presence steady as the land itself. "There's nothing here for you," he said, his tone like stone against steel. "Turn back." The riders laughed, the sound harsh in the night air. Their leader's gaze swept the crowd before settling on her, a cruel smile spreading across his face. "She knows why we're here," he called. "You can stand in the way, or you can hand her over. Makes no difference to us." Her heart pounded so loudly she thought everyone could hear it. The truth had been dragged into the open, and there was no denying it now. She felt every eye turned toward her, felt the weight of their shock, their questions, their fear. She wanted to crumble beneath it, but then she saw him, standing firm, his gaze locked on hers with quiet strength. "Tell them," he said softly, just loud enough for her to hear. "Don't let fear speak for you." Her voice shook at first, but once she began, the words poured out like water breaking through a dam. She told them who those men were, what they had done, and why she had fled. She spoke of the debts they demanded, the cruelty they inflicted, and the years she had carried the burden of running. Her shame burned, but in the telling, a strange kind of strength rose inside her. For the first time, she wasn't hiding. Silence followed her confession, heavy and uncertain. The settlers looked at one another, weighing her truth against their fear. Then slowly one man stepped forward, rifle still in hand. "You're part of this place now," he said simply. "We don't hand over our own." Others nodded, their resolve hardening like iron in the fire. Murmurs turned into firm voices of agreement. She felt tears sting her eyes as the weight she had carried for so long shifted. These people, strangers not long ago, had chosen to stand with her. The riders pressed closer, their leaders snarling threats, but the settlers did not waver. He stood at the front, his voice calm but fierce. "If you want her, you'll have to come through all of us." What followed was not a quick clash, but a long, tense standoff beneath the unforgiving moon. The riders tested the settlement's strength, circling, shouting, firing warning shots, but each time they were met with steady defiance. The settlers fired back when pressed, their shots cracking through the night, sending sparks of fear into the riders' ranks. The valley rang with the sound of conflict, the smell of gunpowder sharp in the air. She stayed near the heart of the settlement, hands trembling yet refusing to flee. Every shot that rang out felt like it tore through her soul, but she knew she could not run anymore. She thought of the woman in the tavern who had told her trouble would either be stood against or roll her under. Tonight, she had made her choice. When the dust finally began to settle, the riders pulled back. Their leader glared from the ridge, his face twisted with fury, but he knew the truth. This was no easy prey. The settlers had stood firm, and breaking them would cost more than he was willing to pay. With curses that echoed into the night, he turned his horse and rode away, his men following like shadows peeling back into the dark. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the labored breaths of those who had held the line. Slowly, Lantern light revealed faces pale with exhaustion, but alive with the glow of victory. A few bore wounds, but none had fallen, and that was something close to a miracle. She stood frozen, hardly able to believe it was over. He came to her then, his face streaked with dust and sweat. His eyes weary, yet still burning with that quiet strength she had come to know. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then he reached out, his hand steady, and she took it, feeling the ground solid beneath her feet for the first time in years. The days that followed were filled with both relief and rebuilding. The settlement bore scars, but it also carried pride. It had faced down danger together, and in doing so, had bound themselves tighter as a community. No one looked at her with suspicion anymore. If anything, they looked at her with respect. She was no longer just a stranger passing through. She belonged. For her, the change ran even deeper. The fear that had driven her for so long no longer ruled her steps. She still carried her past, but it no longer owned her. She had spoken her truth, and others had chosen to stand beside her. That was a kind of freedom she had never known. One evening, when the sky blazed with streaks of red and gold, she found herself back by the river. The water rushed steady, as it always had, carrying the memory of the night everything had changed. He joined her quietly, his presence as grounding as the earth beneath her boots. "You didn't run," he said softly. She smiled, the words sinking deep. "Not this time." He studied her a moment, then tilted his head with that familiar teasing glint. "Darlin, I told you. Stand with me." Her laugh broke free, light and unguarded, carried away on the breeze. She realized then that the Wild West was not just a place of hardship and danger, it was also a place where hearts could be remade, where courage could be found in the most unlikely moments, where love could grow even under the harshest skies. The moon rose once more over the valley, silver and eternal, shining down on the land that had tested her, and in the end, set her free. She knew there would be more storms, more shadows to face, but she no longer feared them. With him by her side, and the strength she had found within herself, she was ready. The prairie wind whispered across the open land, carrying with it the promise of new beginnings. The Wild West was still untamed, still full of dangers and unknowns, but it was also full of life, of courage, and of second chances. And for her, that was enough. The settlement returned to its rhythm, the sound of hammers and laughter blending with the songs of the land. Children played again in the dusty streets, women hung their wash beneath the sun, and men rode out to tend the herds. Life moved forward, as it always did. But beneath it all lingered the memory of a night when they had all stood together, unbroken. As she walked back toward the cabins, hand brushing against his, she felt the weight of the past ease further. The ghosts were still there, but they no longer held her prisoner. She was no longer running. She was standing. And under the Wild West moon, with the man who had teased her into courage and the community that had chosen to fight beside her, she finally knew she was home.